Hey there. So I think the time has come for me to record my next olfactory processing video. And this one is focused on a topic that I think is actually really interesting and that is pretty useful information for anybody who is involved in any sort of group work or who thinks of themselves as being particularly sensitive to others' emotions. Those of you who characterize yourselves as empaths, well, there's some information here that I think is worth noting. In my first video on the power of scent, I talked about the basics of olfactory processing and how you could use olfactory conditioning, olfactory memory as a tool in order to help you get into particular frames of mind, to help you be more effective in particular kinds of contexts or workings. But the whole discussion was really centered on scents that are produced by other things. Things like flowers, incense, objects in your environment that can alter mood and state of mind. Today's talk is going to focus exclusively, however, on social chemosignals, which is to say, scents we produce as individuals to broadcast information about our emotional states and our experiences to other people. And this idea of individuals communicating with one another through scent is one that's been popular on and off for a long time and the source of a great deal of snake oil that's been sold, primarily to people hoping to get laid. And the concept's been communicated largely with use of this term pheromone. So you'll get, pheromonal perfumes or what have you being packaged, marketed, and sold to people, and that stuff is largely bullshit. And I'm going to stay away from the term pheromone because, one, the term was generated and used in a very particular context that doesn't really apply well to people, and so using it, I think, makes the water here unnecessarily murky. The fact is there isn't really any scientific consensus on what constitutes a pheromone. And older, more classic definitions, if you like, rely fairly heavily on how pheromones are supposedly processed. And in most species, that would be, this isn't really true anymore, but initially it was really conceptualized as pheromones are processed primarily via the vomeronasal organ, which is vestigial in humans. We do not process scent this way, so it doesn't make sense to use this term. And anyways, there's no need to unnecessarily complicate things in that regard. So in the scientific lit, we would be talking about human chemosignals, which is to say scents, chemicals that we produce and release primarily through breath and sweat through our skin, and which in humans are processed by the olfactory bulb, which is that brain region that handles the primary processing of scent, before that processing is then relayed to other parts of the brain, particularly emotional processing centers. Now, in the last video, I also talked about how a great deal of olfactory processing is unconscious. We're not aware of it. And that absolutely holds true, and is probably even more true when we're talking about the scent of other people. The fellow who's been exercising a while, wearing yesterday's shirt, and who could use a shower notwithstanding, we by and large aren't particularly aware of the scents being produced by other people. Nor are we aware of just how intensely the unconscious processing of those scents changes our own mental processing, and therefore our own behavior and perception of the world around us. These scents we produce, they are a form of communication, and this language is specialized to communicate emotional information, particularly information related to survival. From an evolutionary standpoint, you can think of it this way. If you're a social animal living in a group and one of your number is attacked by a predator, but you're not in direct line of sight, or perhaps you're not in direct earshot, by the time your group comes back, there's nothing to see, there's nothing to hear, except scent lingers. The chemicals released by both the predator and the prey are little chemical tags that hover in and infuse an area and leave behind a story. And in so doing, the rest of that poor prey's group can be, if not made consciously aware of the danger that now exists in this area, there's a predator somewhere nearby, at least prime them, which is to say, set in motion the cognitive wheels that would be necessary to induce a very rapid flight response in order to increase their chances of surviving if that predator returns. Now, this legacy of chemical communication is something we have retained as a species, and it's something that absolutely colors day-to-day interactions, but to which we are largely blind. To give you an example, if I were to have you smell the sweat of somebody who had just been exercising versus the sweat of somebody who had just had the pants scared off them, even if you didn't realize you were smelling sweat from either of these people, even if you didn't recognize that there was any difference in terms of the scent of your environment, the sweat from the person who was scared will be processed differently by your brain and will activate your own threat detection systems. Cues in your environment that would otherwise be processed as if they're entirely benign would now more likely be interpreted as threatening. You will become faster to recognize aggressive expressions on the faces of other people. Your motor systems will have been kicked into gear so that you can run at the first sign of trouble, and you won't realize that any of this is happening. Now think about the culture in which most of us live. Many of us will be city folk. Some of you lucky people are homesteaders out in the country, but even then, imagine yourself in a mall. Imagine just how loud that chemosensory signaling is. If it were music, it would be blaring in your ears. And as you go about your shopping, not really paying attention to these cues, they are constantly being detected by your nose, processed by your brain, and changing the very way you're responding to everything in your environment from moment to moment. Now, another interesting thing about this is one's sensitivity to these experiences depends on one's genetics. Although we all share the same constellation of olfactory receptor genes, and so can all, by and large, pick up the same range of scents, chemical signals, there is huge variability in the specific sequences of those receptor genes, and even very subtle changes in the sequence of those genes seems to play an important role in how sensitive we are to the chemicals that bind those receptors, and interestingly, the valence that we attribute to those scents, which is to say, how positively or negatively we perceive those scents. And between this individual variation and the fact that so much of this processing is occurring unconsciously, even though we are significantly affected by the emotional tone of scents, and I was using the example of fear or threat, but the chemicals released in response to laughter and joy can also affect processing. But because this is so unconscious, we're actually really quite bad at identifying whether those human chemosignals are ones associated with fear or sadness or joy, which is to say that we don't consciously know which of the emotions is being broadcast, but we can tell the difference between the emotions. So a recent study reported that people could differentiate between sweat that was produced by people experiencing sexual arousal, amusement, fear, and disgust with an accuracy of 67 to 83%, which is really quite high. And yet they could not say which scent was the one that was produced during sexual arousal, which one was produced during disgust. And by and large, there appears to be a sex difference in the extent to which people are able to detect and process this sort of social scent signal. Women reportedly have a processing advantage in detecting social emotional stimuli, particularly those with weak perceptual salience. Now, for those who are wondering, I'm using sex as chromosomal sex as the scientific definition of the term. I'm not talking about gender here. And although I'm not aware personally of any studies that look at gender identity and this sort of social chemosensory processing, there is actually some data suggesting that sexual orientation is not only broadcast to a certain extent by these chemosignals, but also that homosexual versus heterosexual individuals process these sex-related chemosignals differently. All of which is to say that I wouldn't be remotely surprised by data suggesting that gender identity also colored social cue processing in the realm of olfaction. Finally, it's also worth noting that the specificity of the emotion being experienced when one produces sweat or releases these social chemosignals also matters when it comes to processing of these chemosignals. The emotional purity of the state one is in sort of gets translated and broadcast to other people as well. So the smell given off by somebody who's just been skydiving for the first time, which is, yes, a stressful event and involves fear, but also joy and excitement, well, that's going to send a murkier signal that isn't going to bias the receiver's mental processing in a clear direction, the same way that the chemo signals associated with someone making love to their partner or somebody who just escaped a mugging by the skin of their teeth would. So, okay, but what does this have to do with our spiritual practice, per se? Well, I think it has a great deal to do with group cohesion. And in my mind, sort of begs the question of whether some of the old traditions, particularly those related to purification, are a direct result of the way we're influenced by these chemosignals. For instance, if you're walking around all day and you're interacting with people, which will involve a certain amount of skin-to-skin contact and quite a bit of contact with objects that have been in other people's hands, you're accumulating scents and bodily secretions that are shaping the way your mind is working. Thus, the concept of the ritual bath. That sort of purification is quite literally washing off these chemical messengers of emotional states that you've just been accumulating all day. And since we seem to be most sensitive to those negative emotional cues, because those were the ones most immediately and fundamentally related to survival, carrying those with you into sacred space, into circle, may have a negative effect on your capacity to achieve the state of mind that you're looking for. If you work in a coven or a group, particularly if it's a group that works skyclad, and now I'm thinking back to British traditional Wicca, and whatever you may think of the motivations or benefits of circling naked, it is inarguably advantageous from a chemosignaling standpoint. The capacity to transmit your emotional state can, in that case, create a feed-forward and then feedback loop where your own mental processing both reinforces and is reinforced by other people's responses to your emotional state. And in so doing, the capacity of this group to align in terms of intention and feeling is heightened. At the individual level, this information is also pretty relevant to anybody who is empathic, whose own emotions are subject to the energies of other people around them, the energies and sense of other people around them. And I quite frankly think that the odds of one's empathy being unrelated to how sensitive one is to chemosignals is, basically zero. It would be ridiculous to suggest that these sorts of chemosignals aren't playing a role in that, particularly in light of findings, again, relating back to this issue of sex differences in social chemosignal processing, that have demonstrated that females show both greater activation of emotional processing centers as well as brain regions that are specialized for the generation of empathy. Now, empathy is a trait that is shared by most people, although to a greater or lesser extent. Of course, there are exceptions. It is a trait that is notably lacking among people who have antisocial personality disorder. And I personally find it quite interesting to think about how people on the higher end of the empathy spectrum can help attenuate the sensitivity to the emotional broadcasting through scent of other people. for those individuals who consider themselves to be empaths and who feel like they're quite good at identifying specific emotional states in other people, to what extent does that reflect perhaps more conscious awareness of this emotional processing response that they get from other people's emotional chemosignals? And to what extent is heightened empathy a result of greater openness, which, as I've discussed before, is a feature of people who display greater responses to placebo, those who benefit most from things like ritual, probably a trait that is highly associated with being on the sorts of spiritual paths that we are. Because that openness, I think, is tantamount to releasing the brake on the environment's ability to impact you. It's letting up on self-control a little bit so that you can incorporate and internalize more information, more symbolism, more cues from the world around you. And I think it's very likely that that openness is really tied closely to the extent to which we feel kinship and connection to our world, to nature and our gods. And in light of all of this, how can one use shielding to protect oneself from being overwhelmed by the emotions being broadcast by others? From a mechanistic standpoint, the shielding might be a means of reducing one's openness, which would absolutely work, but comes with the downside of reducing that openness across the board, if that's how it's working. But if, as an empath, you can instead develop a method of shielding that directs your own mind to, if not disregard, at least reduce its responses to emotional state, a shield that is basically designed to stop emotional mirroring, then I think in that case you might be able to protect yourself from the negative effects of other people's emotional broadcasting without necessarily sacrificing the openness that keeps you tied to the general tone of the environment and the world you walk through. This sort of specific shielding is something that I personally intend to incorporate in my practice, specifically because I don't like the idea of divorcing myself from sensitivity to my surroundings. As it is, I have much greater facility with mentally and cognitively based craft and spiritual work, and that is the sort of thing that I can slip into with relative ease. That is what I slip into by default, whereas I still have to consciously reach outward in order to feel connected. And so I view anything that can interfere with achieving greater connectedness as being suboptimal for me. At the same time, I am particularly prone, I think, to the negative emotional effects of particular environments. For instance, I am, among my friends and family, famously bad at tolerating things like malls. I can handle it for maybe 20 minutes before I have to get out, and then it takes me a couple hours to recover from the absolute shit mood I'm in. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that all of that is due to my tendency not to sieve out negative emotions being broadcast by others. I have no difficulty believing that the obnoxious design of most malls and department stores plays a role. But there is a notable difference in my tolerance to that sort of environment depending on the population density there at the time. And given the sheer amount of human traffic that so regularly passes through that environment, from a practical standpoint, it's essentially impossible to avoid being exposed to these emotional clouds. Now, admittedly, there's a hole in my knowledge in that I actually don't know how rapidly these different chemosignals degrade. But I suspect that a decent chunk of what many of us will simply reference as the energy of a place is tied to the emotions that we've experienced and broadcast chemically while occupying those spaces. And so the urge to clean from ceiling to floor, top to bottom, your apartment after a messy breakup is an absolutely appropriate response that is literally washing that person out of that space, washing away the energies, if you will, that they carried with them while there. the haunted house has been imbued by the fear sweat released by those who are terrorized there, and subsequently by any person who's picked up on those chemical signals upon entering. The curse mojo, sown in anger and with evil intent, and stashed under the pillow of the victim, releases a steady stream of molecular aggression to poison the victim's mind as they sleep. And these very real, scientifically documented occurrences, validated through empirical study, simply slips under most people's radar. And this sort of social chemical communication, to me, is very much an example of one of those things that occurs and is given little credence, but which is in a fuzzy and perhaps ill-defined way, sort of recognized by a lot of spiritual folk as something that happens and goes on and matters, even though the mechanisms aren't necessarily entirely clear. And so this is the kind of shit that I absolutely love, because it provides, after the fact, a means of conceptualizing spiritual or magical acts in a way that is testable and which can be validated through scientific trial. Anyway, I'll stop there for now, and thank you very much for popping by and giving this a listen. I hope some of what I talked about today is something you'll find useful, and at some point in the future, I think I'll pop back and update you guys on my progress regarding developing a shielding technique focused on reducing my unconscious mirroring of emotions transmitted by others. So until next time, I hope you have a wonderful day.